KIDO Talk Radio, Kevin Miller in the morning. Thank you for joining us. Getting ready for the 4th of July. It's July 3rd, and joining us now, a man who has dedicated himself to protecting America, both in the courtroom and, of course, on the field, our great friend Chuck Ambrose. Mr. Ambrose, good to have you back.
Thank you, sir. Good to be here.
You know, which was more demanding, Ole Miss or the Air Force Academy?
Oh, Air Force by a long shot. Unlike a lot of folks that went to law school straight out of undergraduate degrees, I had 7 or 8 years in the real world before I went back, and it made all the difference. It wasn't nearly as imposing.
That's, you've done so much in your life, and now you're here in Idaho. You've got an alias, which we'll get to.
Yes.
You know, is there one particular accomplishment that defines you? Is it being an Academy grad? Is it being a JAG officer? Is it being an author, a family guy? What do you think it is?
Oh, I would say the 30 years in the courtroom as an assistant United States attorney, a federal prosecutor. The Air Force Academy certainly paved the way for a lot of the rest, but in terms of the actual work achievements, I would say it was the federal prosecutor experience.
All right. I'm wondering what the feds would think of you having this alias as Mark Rainier.
Well, they better not think much about it because unlike some of our past attorneys general, I read the conflict of interest rules, and that's why I have a pen name for when I was writing while still employed by the Justice Department. I followed every one of their regulations to the T, did not use my position or official name at the time, and so that's one of the reasons I used a pen name.
Fair enough. Let's get right into it. The president says it's time to move on. Robert Mueller, best friends with James Comey, that you disclosed on this program, when you're not on Rush Limbaugh, when you're not on with Mark Levin, when you're not on with Andrew, the
Wilkow,
right, the Wilkow majority, got that. You disclosed that they were friends. Now Mueller looks like he's going to testify. Your thoughts?
Well, it's one area where I have to disagree with Professor Dershowitz from Harvard. He has claimed that Mueller cannot say anything beyond his report because that would violate DOJ regs and ethics policies. But to me, that's a very naive assertion to make because had Mr. Mueller ever worried about the DOJ regulations or the canons of ethics that apply to the prosecutorial function, we wouldn't have a completely biased and out of control investigative team. We wouldn't have had a delay in his no collusion findings beyond the midterms designed specifically to benefit the Democrats, and we would not have had volume 2 of his so-called report, that part that I call the Weissman dossier. Mr. Mueller has had no reservation whatsoever about violating every canon of ethics and every Department of Justice regulation applicable to his function, so it will not surprise me at all if he goes completely off the reservation and off the rails in his testimony before Congress. I expect him to try to do so. I expect him to have a very rough time with the questions from the Republican side of the aisle, dealing with why he hired nothing but basically totally biased people from the Democratic camp when he was supposed to be doing an unbiased investigation. And there are so many problems with what he's done and his team has done all throughout this appointment that I think he will regret having appeared.
Well, and yet he's going to do that. Let's get into this. The Mueller report is over. The Democrats continue to make all these unsubstantiated allegations. How challenging is this to the faith in our legal system?
Well, it's very challenging. And unfortunately, the general public probably has no idea how far from the norm that this investigation has been. It would literally, Kevin, take me about 2 hours to go through step by step on the aberrations that have occurred with this thing. I can outline a few. For example, if you're going to file an indictment to violate campaign finance laws, that indictment should be titled Conspiracy to Violate the Campaign Finance Laws, or Conspiracy to Commit This Offense. Instead, these guys titled their indictment Conspiracy Against the United States for no other reason than to generate public outcry against Trump and his administration. Normally, to get a nighttime warrant to roust somebody out of bed, you've got to assure a court that this is a person who will inflict danger upon the arrest team, who has evidence in their possession that will be immediately destroyed unless you do a SWAT-style raid. I have never in 30 years seen white-collar defendants treated in the fashion that Manafort and others were treated by the Mueller team. You've got people that he hired on this team who had been the subject of criticism by district courts, appellate courts, and in Weissman's case by the Supreme Court, which reversed his Arthur Anderson case 9-0. That almost never happens. And so you've got a collection of hyper-biased people who have no reservations whatsoever about breaking every rule and canon of ethics in the book in order to achieve the result that they have in mind. And yet, in this case, they still couldn't get there with respect to the collusion issue. So then they write this second volume, despite the canons of ethics and the Justice Department regs saying that if you're not going to indict, you will not insult or impugn the reputation of the target of the investigation. And it is just beyond the pale how far afield these guys have gone.
Our great friend Chuck Ambrose joining us, retired prosecutor with us from the Department of Justice, best-selling author. So let's talk a little bit about Strzok, Page, McCabe, people that Sean Hannity and you have been talking about for years.
Where do you start? Again, these are people who have violated the FBI's regs. They violated Department of Justice regulations. Their bias is very evident in all of the now collected emails and texts that they tried to bury for so long. And, Mr. Strzok was so biased and his bias so hyperbolic that even Mueller had to can him. And these are the people who conspired to create this insurance policy, which we now see embodied in the Mueller report. And it is nothing more than a pack of lies. And to think that Mueller and Comey and collection of their minions that you mentioned went to courts of law, the FISA courts, and lied to them repeatedly, and yet have suffered essentially no consequences. I cannot believe that the FISA courts have not just been up in arms, but it is further evidence of the abomination, if we can call it that, of the deep state and how militarized the intelligence agencies, the law enforcement agencies, the Department of Justice, and even the courts were to achieve political means. We've got a long way to go to recover from it.
Well, and yet, you hope that the Attorney General will be able to find out these things. I mean, McCabe pretty much, it's been detailed, just went on his own. Even Strzok and Page said there's nothing there, and he said, we're going in anyway. We're going to get this guy. We're going to get the president.
Exactly. It's the Russian method. Show me the man, I'll find you the crime. It's Beria and the secret police all over again, except here it's people in the institutions that we used to trust with good reason, taking over those positions. And, if you told me 15 years ago that this could happen in this country, I would not have believed it.
And yet it has. Our great friend Chuck Ambrose joining us. How do you think, here on KIDO Talk Radio, do you think Barr will be able to get to the bottom of this, or will the Democrats and others, get in his way, and we'll talk about the scandal-free Obama administration forever?
Well, President Trump has said publicly recently that if he had one do-over, it would be Jeff Sessions, and I cannot agree with that more. If not for Jeff Sessions, you would not have had Rotten Rod Rosenstein, you would not have had Mueller, you would not have had all of this mess. Maybe the only other mistake is not firing Comey on day one instead of waiting until a later point. But despite how bad that initial pick was, I don't think he could have done any better than Bill Barr as a successor. And I don't think Barr could have done any better than John Durham as the head dog running this to ground on the other side in terms of the origin of the Trump investigation, if you want to call it that. Durham has been appointed to clean up corruption by now 4 attorneys general. We start with Janet Reno, a Democrat. He was also appointed in another matter by Eric Holder, a Democrat. He was appointed by Michael Mukasey, a Republican appointee, and now again by Barr. He is exactly the man you need, I believe. He is, not a political animal. He is a career prosecutor who will take the evidence and follow it where it leads, and to whomever it leads, regardless of the consequences. It's what we have needed for a good long time.
Chuck, I'm going to ask you to hold that. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought for a minute. More coming up with Chuck. More coming up with Chuck Ambrose, Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio. KIDO Talk Radio. Chuck Ambrose joining us, author, prosecutor, and Idahoan now on KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. So back to the career prosecutor that both Democrats and Republicans shouldn't even look at questioning his credibility.
Correct. And interestingly enough, Mr. Durham, who is now the U.S. Attorney for Connecticut, was endorsed even by the senators from that state. Both, I believe, are Democrats, and one of them, I think, is Blumenthal. So you can't get much farther left than that. But even these people have spoken highly of him, supported his appointment, and spoken to his integrity. One of the things, ironically, that he pursued early on was the corruption in the Boston federal system involving both the prosecutors there and the FBI. And I'm talking about the Whitey Bulger case. Bulger was essentially a serial killer mafia kingpin who became an FBI informant for some reason and was protected by none other than the likes of Robert Mueller as chief of the FBI. And after Mr. Durham got through that investigation, you had FBI agents going to jail, and I'm kind of hoping that happens again because it needs to. But again, he's been appointed to look at several matters of corruption, and to my knowledge, nobody has ever asserted that he did anything but the right thing.
Can you go into the Bulger thing a little bit more?
Well, anybody that wants to really get into the weeds of it can look it up. Again, it's Bulger. He was an organized crime figure in Boston, responsible personally for several murders. But there was an FBI agent named Connolly who signed him up as an informant. And before those two were done with their dirty work, 4 innocent men had been framed and sent to prison. They were actually not, I won't call them completely innocent. They were enemies of Bulger, just put it that way. But they were framed for crimes they did not commit. 2 of them ended up dying in jail. And while the investigation into this was being pursued, Mueller was stonewalling the courts trying to protect Bulger and his status as an informant, and so he is at least partially responsible for these 2 other gentlemen dying in jail when they didn't belong there.
Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio, traffic and weather together. Let's get you to work safely and on time. Good morning, Dave. And rolling right along with our great friend Chuck Ambrose, author, prosecutor. And before we get to some of your books, Chuck, let's talk a little bit about the 2020 presidential scene. I don't know if you caught the debates, but your thoughts on any of the usual suspects trying to replace Donald Trump?
Wow. I don't think the country has ever been faced with a clearer choice in terms of the policies being advocated by the two different sides. It seems that you have traditional Republican constitutionalism on one side, and when I say Republican, I'm not talking about the party sense, but the structure of our republic. And on the other side, you no longer have the Democrat Party of Scoop Jackson and Sam Nunn. You have this left-wing fringe collection that wants to promise nothing but free everything for illegal immigrants, an open border, and nobody getting prosecuted for anything. And, while the children of veterans may not get free college, if you're an illegal immigrant, just ask for it, you'll get it. It boggles my mind how far the left has swung to their extreme, and I think they're going to have a lot of trouble trying to come back to the middle after their primaries in the general election. So I really think that more than any other election in my lifetime, this is a battle for the soul of the nation.
You take a look at, former prosecutors, former attorneys on the stand, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and others. The Department of Justice is very different under a Democrat like Obama than it is under President Trump. Can you define what it was like to work under Lynch and Holder and Reno and the suspects that we talk about all the time? You know those people.
Well, under Reno, it wasn't as bad. You'd see these horrible optic moments like the little boy Ilian Gonzalez, getting returned to Cuba over his objection and that of his family after his mother lost his life, getting him into this country for freedom. And, most of the time, if it's just a traditional type of change in power, there might be some small policy differences at the top, but as long as they're leaving you alone as a worker bee to actually go after bad people and put them where they belong, you don't care. I mean, that's the nature of our system. You salute, move on. They might have more emphasis on a certain type of federal crime, and so more money gets funneled in that direction and new task forces get formed, et cetera, et cetera. As I indicated before, this last period under Obama with Holder and Lynch, you saw such a collapse of integrity at the top, all the way to the Attorney General's office, starting with Fast and Furious, where we stupidly give thousands of essentially automatic weapons to Mexican cartels, and then we recoil in amazement if, half of the Mexican law enforcement community gets murdered. We lose our own people along the border, including border agents and other civilians. So, again, going back to the norm, I used to have to essentially write a book if we wanted to let a pound of marijuana hit the street without tight controls over it. And yet here you're talking about hundreds and thousands of semi-automatic and in some cases functionally automatic weapons going into the hands of organized crime and nobody keeping track of it. It was just so stupid. It was astounding. Then you have the infamous tarmac meeting between Lynch and Bill Clinton when his wife and himself were arguably the targets of an ongoing investigation, whether or not you wanted to call it a matter or whatever. That, as I have previously said, is not something that a first-year law student after their first class in ethics would do. It is that basically a no-no. And yet we have the highest law enforcement person in the country committing that kind of offense. I saw things during the Obama administration that I have never seen before. This fallacy that he was releasing simple drug offenders at the end of his term is nothing more than a lie. These are not people who had a joint in the car. These were kingpin drug dealers who had been preying upon their own communities for years and given life sentences because of it, and he was turning them out. And again, it's nothing I'd seen before, and I hope I never see again.
More coming up with our great friend Chuck Ambrose. You're listening to Kevin Miller. Don't forget the KIDO Talk Radio app available on Google Play, the Apple Store as well. The App Store, that's what they call it. And don't forget our newsletter. You're listening to Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio. KIDO Talk Radio, Kevin Miller in the morning. Hope you're having a great day, getting ready for the 4th. Chuck Ambrose joining us now. Chuck, let's talk a little bit about your life as a graduate of the Academy, as a JAG officer, as a career prosecutor in the Department of Justice. What does the 4th of July mean to you, sir?
Well, I have 4 or 5 shirts that I break out just for this time of year. They have scenes like the flag going up on Iwo Jima, my favorite aircraft, an old P-51 Mustang, which was flown very successfully, not only just in World War II, but even in Vietnam. We had some pilots shooting down MiG jets with those little prop planes. I'm the son of a World War II Mud Marine who was at Guadalcanal in Okinawa. And just as a personal note, I just attended a funeral with the last of that generation on one side of the family, and it really saddens me because of the dedication that they had to the country. I don't think can be matched. And when you watch a film like Saving Private Ryan and see what those kids went through storming Normandy and going through Europe, and then you see some of the current generation being triggered by someone's name chalked on some steps, it's just such a contrast. It's hard to understand.
Do you think we get that today?
I don't think enough of us get it. I'm not trying to be the old curmudgeon saying everything's going to hell. I have seen so many very good young people in every generation still volunteering, still wanting to do the right thing. I don't think that hope is lost by any sense of the word, but I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that the left has commandeered and taken over so many of our educational institutions that they have become propaganda mills. And rather than instilling those values in the young folks from kindergarten through 12 and then college, they seem to be doing everything they can to remove those ideals. And I think we're suffering consequences of that.
Indeed. All right, Chuck, let's talk about your secret identity.
I hope it's not so secret anymore.
No, not at all.
No, as we were talking, I used a pen name in writing my first book, and that is Mark Rayner, and it's a tribute to 2 members of my immediate family that I lost to cancer. A younger brother, Mark, and then Rayner was my mother's maiden name, rather. And I have 6 crime dramas out now on Amazon. I had some real good news with the 5th one, which is called Death Votes Last, and it's pretty timely in terms of the current political climate. The underlying theory is that instead of waiting for an election, one side in an evenly divided Senate wants to change the numbers by killing a member of the other party. And that book has just been nominated as a thriller book of the year by Top Shelf Magazine, which is an online fiction magazine that anyone who wants to can check out. There's a review of the book on there. And it was also picked up as the book of the month for mystery thrillers by another website called minibooks.net. So it's doing very well and seemingly taking off right now. Good surprise.
Can you take us inside the writing process? Everybody has a book in them. You have several, but the decision to do it, then to figure out how to get it published, how to market it. And when I first met you, we used to joke about there's a big difference between you and your classmate, John Grisham.
Well, John was fortunate enough to be successful in what we call the traditional publishing route. And by that I mean getting an agent, getting a publisher, putting your books into physical book and mortar stores everywhere. That's the mythical golden goose of the game. And he writes well enough and was fortunate enough to be maybe the biggest American success story ever in that game. I tried that. I got signed by an agent, and unfortunately, she did nothing but keep me out of print for a year through her own inactivity, the length of the contract I had with her. So being somewhat frustrated with that process, I self-published my first book and used a company that doesn't exist anymore called CreateSpace, but it was an Amazon arm. And so by using them, once your book was published, it went into Amazon, both in the Kindle form and the paperback. So that seemed to be the thing to do at the time, since Amazon was basically revolutionizing the whole publishing game. And first month it sold 25 copies, and the second 50. And I was figuring that sometime 20 years after my death it might pay for itself. But by month 4 it was selling 1,000 copies a month. And so the success of that book certainly prodded me to keep the series going, and I'm glad I've done that. I've certainly not gotten the attention or the wealth that my law school classmate has had, but it's been a paying hobby of sorts and a lot of fun.
Boy, 1,000 books a month, that's pretty good. So CreateSpace doesn't exist anymore. I remember the Wall Street Journal doing a profile on that service many years ago.
Yeah, it's been subsumed into Amazon. Originally it was its own company, then Amazon bought it, and now they have just rebadged it as Kindle Direct Publishing, I believe is what they call it now. But certainly Amazon revolutionized the publishing business by first starting what they call print on demand. If you order one of my paperbacks from Amazon, it is not in stock, as that term used to be known. The order comes in, somebody in the warehouse pushes a button on their computer, and the plant starts whirring, and it makes the single book that was just ordered, and it gets shipped out. So there is no stock space. There's no inventory to worry about. They print whatever is ordered, and they ship it out. It never goes out of print. There are some advantages to being self-published these days. If you're a traditionally published author and your book doesn't do very well, then after the initial print run, it goes out of print and it's not available anymore. And something else a lot of people don't know is that the traditionally published author, unless you're an A-list like Michael Connelly or John Grisham, for the $13 that is paid for one of their books in an airport bookstore, they might get 15 cents. Everything else goes into agents' fees, publishing costs, taxes, inventory, shipping, advertising, that sort of thing. The scale that Amazon offers for its indie authors, as they call them, like me, is much more attractive. In fact, you've got a lot of traditionally published authors that are leaving that game and self-publishing on their own now.
Chuck Ambrose joining us, talking about his books, Mark Rainier on Amazon. Now, how do you put yourself into the mind of a writer where you're doing dialogue, you're describing things? Some call it creativity. Others might call it a mental illness.
Well, it's funny that you use the terms that you just did, because that's exactly what I do. I went to a writers' conference a couple of summers back because people told me that I should. And so I said, well, I'll do this once just to see what it's all about. And I discovered at this conference that I am what they call an organic writer. Now, I had never heard the term before, but what that means is we don't use much of an outline. We have a basic idea, and then we, as you said, plug ourselves into the minds of our characters and then just let it flow. We say, okay, what would this gal or guy have done next, have said next, what would be the logical next step in their investigation. And on the other side, if we're in the heads of the criminal, I've got 30 years of experience in dealing with those people, so I know what they would have done next, where they would have gone, what they have done. And for me, I've got that 30 years of plot line to tap into, and I use a lot of real cases. Sometimes I will merge real cases and synthesize them into a single book. There are real scenes from my trials and the courtroom scenes in the book. So it's a fun mix of actual fact and fiction quite often.
Right. I just couldn't imagine, I'm on a street in Vienna and I see such and such and that's gotta be next level stuff, because we're not reading it as you are as the creator. We're reading it as consumers. And if it doesn't make sense, we don't buy your book.
Right. There's always a translation. I have found that going through the career that I did, that you view things on the street, as you say, a little bit differently. You might see, for example, somebody shaking hands on the corner. I might see a drug transaction in progress if that handshake goes a certain way. It might be the transfer of money. It might be the transfer of the actual dope. Most of the drug trafficking we have in this country is hand-to-hand, small amounts. It's only when you get upstream from those street dealers that you bump into the people that are supplying them, and you have to know how to engage in the physical surveillance, sometimes the electronic surveillance in terms of video or audio wiretaps, and follow the chain of distribution upstream to get to where it really matters when you take someone off. You know to look for things that would indicate someone might be armed. And certainly as a prosecutor, I don't have the expertise that the street officers and detectives do in that regard, but I've spent enough time around them to pick up on a lot of the things that they look for.
And one more segment with our friend Chuck Ambrose. Again, we're getting involved in the creative process, what it takes to be a writer, and, of course, what it takes to work for the government. A lot going on here today as we're kicking off the 4th of July. Don't forget Glenn Beck coming up and the KIDO Talk Radio app. You're listening to Kevin Miller on KIDO Talk Radio. That's 107.5 FM and 580 AM. Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio. Chuck Ambrose joining us now, prosecutor, writer on KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. What do you say to people whose families are deployed, or they're missing their families because they're doing what you did, Chuck, which is being deployed, being away from home?
I just tell them that we're all praying that their loved one comes back. That's something you don't have any control over. They are quite often in harm's way, and God watch over them. That's all you can really hope for. Folks brave enough and dedicated enough to do what has to be done, and you always wish the best for them and their families.
Is it possible here to define the camaraderie that you have in the military, maybe as a young or not so young officer, enlisted or NCO, away from your family, your unit, your extended family becomes your family, that camaraderie that is so unique to the military?
Again, a very astute question. One of the most trying times in our history in terms of the military was Vietnam, and I'll tell you this, it was a surreal thing going through the Air Force Academy at the time that Vietnam was going on. The reason I say that is our instructors quite often were commissioned officers. They had been there. They had seen what was going on, and they were quite often not bashful about telling you that the establishment running the campaign, that being at the time McNamara and his whiz kids, was doing it all wrong. And you hear an Army exchange officer telling you about how they lost 50 men taking a hill only to give it back the next night, and the next day the orders come in to go take it again and waste more lives. And you end up asking these guys what makes you do that? What makes you follow those orders? What makes you fight in the face of things that are that asinine? And the answer almost always comes back the same, and you hear it from people who were in World War II and in Korea and Vietnam, and it is, yes, you go over and your initial enlistment oath is because you believe in the country, and that's why you wear the uniform, why you joined up. But once you're in the fight, the only thing you're fighting for is the guy in the foxhole next to you. That's your family, as you indicated at the time, and you will go through hell or high water for the guy that's doing the same thing at your side.
Very different from the life of the civilian world. Now that you're in the West, you ever get back to Colorado Springs?
I go back there occasionally for a class reunion, things of that nature. It's a different place. They certainly are not going through the same things that we did. Some of that's for the better. Some of it, I think, is not for the better. Trying to think of an example. When we went through, one of the honors you could get as a squadron was something called the Melanophy Trophy, which was the best record in intramural sports. And, those intramural sports, we used to call it intramurder. So, whether it was lacrosse or football, those were some rough games. And that trophy is not even displayed anymore, which disturbs me because the competitive nature really transfers well into some of the combat skills that they're supposed to be learning. So I don't agree with all the changes, but I guess that's time marching on.
KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Kevin Miller, traffic and weather together. Good morning, Dave. And we continue on. I keep wanting to call you Mark Rainier. Chuck Ambrose joining us. How does one come up with a hero?
I have seen so many bad television shows and movies in the law enforcement and legal career. I just wanted to write characters who were doing it not only correctly, but doing it real. And I wanted to describe some of the heroes that I have worked with before, and that it was easy for me because I've seen them. It's not like I had to invent Ant-Man or Batman or anything. There are so many true-to-life heroes who put on police uniforms every day, or just the plain clothes of a federal special agent or a street detective. There are heroes out there everywhere if you look for them.
Right, but putting pen to paper and then making them relatable is easier said than done.
Well, I guess that's true, but what I do is I think about some of those folks I've known. What would they do here? What would they say here? How would they react here? And I just basically rely on the history that I've seen. I've seen lots of people run toward danger. I greatly respect it because they take their oath to serve and protect very, very seriously. And it always saddens me to, pick up the paper or check the web every day, and yet another police officer has been assassinated or, wounded in some absolutely senseless act. I have what we call a thin blue line flag. It's an American flag with a blue stripe replacing one of the white ones. And in theory, we fly it whenever there's been a police death. But Kevin, if we did that these days, it'd be the only flag we ever flew. And it's a very sad thing.
Indeed. Our great friend Chuck Ambrose joining us. Kevin Miller in the morning. KIDO Talk Radio. Finally, Chuck, we take a look at the future of our great nation, and the future of taking chances, whether it's a young Chuck Ambrose going into the Air Force Academy or a Chuck Ambrose with some miles on the odometer with about a minute left here, reinventing himself as an author. What would you say about taking chances?
Well, since you put it in the context of the future of the country, I would say that taking a chance on the next election is not a chance we can afford to take. We have a proven track record, and even though Mr. Trump may not be the most polished and well-mannered guy I've ever seen, I mean, he's a New Yorker, and I don't forgive everything he does that might be offensive, but in terms of the policies that he's followed and the promises he's fulfilled, I think that's a proven track record worth following. And some of the promises being made by the other side, I hope to heaven if they are elected, they don't follow through on them, because I don't think the economy or the nation could stand them.
Chuck Ambrose, Mark Rainier, Amazon.com. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kevin.
Chuck, you have a great day. God bless you, and happy 4th of July, sir.
You too. Hope you have some time off, and that's why you're doing this.
Take care. Thank you, brother.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye. You're listening to Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio.